All right, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be going through human populations. Um, this is one of my favorite subjects to go through in AP Environmental Science, mostly because it kind of deals with a lot of the dynamics and how do humans actually function as kind of a species. And even though, yes, there are individual cultures, it does tend to follow these common trends. So, our outline for today, we're going to talk about population growth and those limits to growth, human demographics, uh, so fertility, mortality, lifespan, and life expectancy, um, population growth, and factors that oppose that growth. We're going to talk about demographic transitions going from the different levels of society: industrial, pre industrial, post industrial, family planning, which is something that is unique to humans, and the future of human populations. All right, so looking at population growth. Until the Middle Ages, human populations were held in check by disease, famines, war, and they grew very slowly. Um, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion. And then from there, it took 150 years to reach 3 billion. And right now, we're sitting a little over 7. 12 years to go from 5 to 6 billion. And then, so what that means is that human populations tripled during just the 20th century. All right. And a lot of this is rapid expansion. You have to think that the United States went from under a million to 300 million in 200 years. So here is kind of a graph of when everything has kind of occurred. So you can see that like populations have sat pretty low, and you have billions on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. So you can see how the population stays relatively low. The reason there's a break in here is because the population just kind of hangs out at that point. You do see some minor fluctuations, and then you see as we start to get into the Middle Ages, population does increase a little bit, mostly due to expeditions. We're starting to branch out as humans, and we have technology to do that. We have clothing and stuff that permits us to live in warmer or colder climates. Then the plague happens, and there's one of the few times where there's a drastic drop, and then we just see this massive explosion around the Industrial Revolution. But a lot of that momentum had happened prior to that. So what are these limits to the growth? So Thomas Malthus, which we've talked about before, argued human populations tend to increase exponentially while food production is plentiful. If you've ever taken an airplane, you see there's a lot of empty space, but we also have to be able to feed everybody. So humans inevitably outstrip food supplies and eventually collapse. And human populations only stabilize by positive checks. Humans are too lazy and immoral to voluntarily reduce birth rates. And I know that sounds like it's really mean, but look at a lot of populations where there are there's a social push to try to have as many children as possible. On top of that, look at what it takes in order to control a population. It involves either abstinence or the use of some sort of contraceptive, which, again, the too lazy part of that. So looking at Marx, population growth is a symptom rather than a root cause of poverty and other social problems. So real causes of these problems are exploitation and oppression. So the way to slow population growth and alleviate many social problems is through social justice. And then looking at both of their ideas today, so the neo-Malthusians believe we are approaching or have already surpassed the Earth carrying capacity. This is, we know now that this is false because the Earth's carrying capacity is estimated to be between 12 and 20 billion based off of how food is distributed. And we should make overpopulation issues our first priority. If you believe that we are already past the carrying capacity, that means that there is a crash coming. And so we should try to make solving that problem our first priority in order to alleviate the gigantic crash. Because remember, as we saw in the previous PowerPoint, as you start to exceed that limit, it ends up going well below carrying capacity. Neo-Marxists believe eliminating oppression and poverty through social justice is the only solution to population problems. There is a slight bit of merit in this, but it's less to do with social justice and more to do with the progression of society as it exists. Wealth and resource distribution must be addressed. So part of that is making sure that everyone has enough food in order to eat. I don't own a television myself. Well, actually I do now, but I don't have cable. So, but back when I did have cable, there were those ads where it's like for X number of cents per day, you can help a child in need who's starving, things like that. That is because they lack just basic food items. And there's other things associated with that, but that is part of it, is taking a small bit of what you earn and giving it to someone who is basically well below what would be considered poverty. So how does technology play a role in this? Technological optimists argue that Malthus is wrong in his predictions because he failed to account for scientific progress. Current bursts of growth was stimulated by scientific and industrial revolutions. Another thing is just agricultural revolutions. We're able to make more things now because our agricultural practices are better than they've ever been. I know that there's some kind of farmers that still do things the way that they did in the old days, but there are quite a few farmers that have embraced technology and embraced science, because what that does is that increases their yield. It increases the amount of money that they can make. On top of that, it also saves them money in the long run. So can more people be beneficial? More people means larger markets, more workers, and increased efficiency due to mass production. There is a reason why a lot of products are being mass produced in China. On top of human labor costs being very low, you also just have a lot of people, and therefore you have that increased productivity. Greater numbers also provide more intelligence and enterprise to overcome problems. This is why, if you ever look at a company that has like what you would call a think tank, a lot of times they just have a lot of people that are involved in it. Why? Well, because the more people you have, the more input and the more solutions you can come up with. Because if the solution to a problem is to think about it, the more, I guess, hands or brains you have in that conversation, the better it's going to be. And then just looking at human ingenuity and intelligence. All right, I get cold when I lay on the couch. Okay, what's the solution to that? Well, what if I just invented a backwards bathrobe, and hence the Snuggie was made? And that's the thing, is it seems like it's a stupid piece of technology, but it solves a problem, and that is ingenuity. All right, and you could say that about a ton of different products. The washing machine, for instance. You no longer have to hand wash clothes. I could put everything into this one container with a little bit of soap and hit the start button and come back 30 minutes later knowing that my clothes are clean. And then I can move those up to a dryer, press the start button, and know that when I come back in 30 minutes, my clothes are going to be dry. Therefore, a lot of this ingenuity has actually helped with progress, because instead of spending, an hour washing and drying clothing, I can now spend that hour doing something else, right? I can start to add multitasking into that, or I guess not necessarily multitasking, but prioritization into that. So I can start a task that's automated and then do something else in the meantime. So looking at human demographics. Demographics, this is basically all vital stats about people: birth, death, distribution, population size. This includes a lot more stuff: age, all sorts of stuff. Demographics is basically, you could think of it as metadata for humans. Like when someone calls you up and they say, or if your phone number ever gets leaked out there, you'll end up getting phone calls from like political agencies and stuff. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to poll people. And yes, their questions are very biased, but a lot of times what they do is they want to get a footprint of what's going on. We know that gerrymandering is an issue. That is why a lot of times they like to know how much money do each household or do households make? What's the education level of those households? Because that helps draw those districting lines. If you want to see a really good example of that, look at districting lines in Texas. It's pretty crazy about how they draw a lot of their districting lines, but that is all based off of human demographics. So October 12th, 1999, the UN officially declared the human population had reached 6 billion. As a reference, it's April 21st today, 2020, and we're over 7 billion right now. So this is an estimation at best. Again, when they send out like right now it's a census year because it's every 10 years and we're on our 10th year. And so when they come and they knock on your door, they mail you the thing or whatever, it's that a lot of times is relying on integrity of the person filling that out accurately. If I were to check on there, we have 3 people living in this household, even though there's only 2 people in my household, that has increased the population by 1. And it seems very small, but those are taking that information and getting those demographics is key so that we can make projections and do certain things, right? If I want to, let's say I want to open up another hospital in Fort Wayne. I want to open up another hospital and I need to estimate that, let's say for every 5,000 citizens, I need 1 ICU bed. As like, I don't know if that's the case, but let's say that that's the information that I'm using. If those numbers are incorrect on the census, then I might under or overestimate the amount of resources I need, and either that means that there's not going to be enough or there's some that's going to be wasted. And this is why when the UN does their population estimate, it's just that, it's an estimate. They did not go around and just ask everybody, because a lot of times it's hard to track those numbers down. In South America, and there's a lot of uncontacted tribes. We do have some information about it, but not a whole lot. There's a recent story hit the news, recent being a few years ago, of a uncontacted population in the Indian Ocean, and that population, we don't have perfect estimates of it because we can't get near the island. The humans that live on that island are extremely violent, and they take action against anyone who tries to approach, shooting bows and arrows at helicopters. It makes it very difficult for them to gather information off of it. And it's also one of those things, like, does it matter whether we estimate their population at 21 or 31? Like, how much of an impact is that going to make when you're literally talking about billions? So looking at population densities, you can kind of see where a lot of these populations are kind of located at. So us here in Fort Wayne, you could see that we have a decent population density. We kind of fall into this range. When I was out in South Dakota, very, very low. I've told stories in class about how I used to go on a bike ride when I was in South Dakota, and it would be 25 miles round trip, and I wouldn't see a single car on the road the whole time I was out there. And it's not like I was cycling at like midnight. You know, I was out there during hours when you'd expect to see people traveling. You can see where there's a high amount of population density. So a lot in India and China, the 2 biggest countries in the world. They have a very, very high density, mostly centered around much of the metropolitan areas, especially in China, Beijing, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Shanghai, places like that. I'm not too familiar with India as far as how their major cities, just because I haven't really into it. So looking at 2 demographic worlds. First is poor and young and rapidly growing. So this occurs in less developed countries. You see it a lot in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. There are some well-defined, high or modernized cultures and places in Africa, mostly at the very, very south and the very, very north. Same thing with Asia. And then in Latin America, same thing. But 80% of the world's population, and they account for 90% of the projected growth. The second is wealthy, old, and mostly shrinking. I'm going to amend mostly shrinking to slow growing. So you see this a lot in North America, Western Europe, and Japan. The average age in these populations is about 40. So it tends to be kind of middle-ish age. Compare that to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It tends to be a lot younger than that. And these populations are expected to decline. Are they declining right now? No, but they're expected to in the future. So if you look at less developed regions, you see a massive explosion in population growth, while in more developed regions, you tend to see more of a flatter curve as far as how much growth there is and where these are centered at. And there's a lot of different reasons to that. We'll get to that a little bit. So fertility and birth rates. So crude birth rate is the number of births in a year per 1,000 people, and it's not adjusted at all for population characteristics. Total fertility rate is the number of children born to an average woman in the population during her life. So that is going to be the key, is the total fertility rate. And then zero population growth is where birth and immigration is equal to deaths and emigration. So in equals out means zero population growth. So looking at mortality and death rates, your crude death rates, same as crude birth rates, but it's the number of deaths per 1,000 in a given year. In poorer countries, it tends to be average around 20, while in wealthier, it's averaged about 10. Rapidly growing countries, some rapidly growing countries have very low crude death rates compared to slower growing countries due to higher proportion of young people in the population. Younger people tend to be a little bit healthier. They tend to just do a little bit better overall. Looking at population growth rates. So you have a natural increase. This is where your, it's crude birth rates minus crude death rates. Total growth rate includes immigration and emigration. So ins and outs. Lifespan and life expectancy. Life expectancy is your average age a newborn can expect to attain in any given society. For example, in the US, if I say the average life expectancy of a male is 75, I don't know if that's it, I just made the number up, but let's say it's 75. Well, but my great-grandfather lived to be 90. Okay, it's average. Obviously, there are some that die when they're really young, some that die when they're really old, but for the most part, that is what the average is where you can expect most people to kind of live to. So declining mortality is the primary cause of most population growth in the last 30 years. It's not that people are having more children, it's that people are dying a lot less due to modern medicine. It's no longer dangerous to go to the doctor. You know, it used to be, you go to the doctor with a cough and they're like, oh yeah, you have ghosts in your blood. You should do some drugs about it. Now it's, you know, I go to the doctor with a cough and it's like, here's an expectorant. Or you have coronavirus and you need to go on a ventilator. Worldwide, the average life expectancy has risen from 40 to 65.5 over the past century. One of the coolest things I learned when I was in a history class is the reason that a lot of populations start to increase in size is because people live longer, and therefore you have the invention of grandparents, and grandparents add another person that can help take care of children. So greatest progress has been made in developing countries. So looking at this is the average on the y-axis. You have life expectancy. On the x-axis, you have annual money per capita gross national product. Basically, how much money does the country earn per person? So if you look at a country like Japan, very high gross national product, and also very high life expectancy. Norway, same. US tends to be up there. But then you look at other countries, Sierra Leone, very low with a very low life expectancy. Russia tends to be kind of an outlier. They have a pretty average-ish life expectancy. And then, it's slightly below average, but then looking at their annual gross national product. But a lot of that just has to do with what life is like in Russia. You know, it's like you walk outside and all of a sudden there's a a bear that's drunk on vodka going through berserker rage. Demographic implications of living longer. What does it mean when you live longer? So a population growing rapidly due to natural increase has more young people than a stationary population. We had talked about this yesterday when we discussed demographic, or on Friday when we had discussed demographics. So both rapidly and slow growing countries can have a problem with dependency ratio. It's the number of non-working compared to working individuals in a population. So looking at Kenya versus United States, you notice in Kenya, very few people at the top, a lot at the bottom. It kind of makes that this bell shape where it's flared out at the end, compared to in the United States, looking at when people were born. So this would be their age in here. You can kind of see that it tends to be pretty steady, except for the boomers, and then tapers out as you start to get near the top. This just happens to be because you're approaching that life expectancy, but you tend to have a flare at the boomers, and then the millennial range down here at the bottom tends to be pretty consistent and even with the group above it. So why is this color coded? This is your pre-reproductive, this is your reproductive, and this is your post-reproductive time frame. So emigration and immigration. So these play a large role in human population dynamics. So it's developed regions expect 2 million immigrants per year over the next 50 years. Why? Because that's where everything is. That's where food and jobs and money and everything else is. Immigration is a controversial issue. Guest workers often perform dangerous or disagreeable work and often being paid low wages with few rights. This is kind of an issue of why there's a video online that's really interesting. It's called Africa is China's China. Why? Because you have a ton of people that work there that will work for very, very low wages, because any wage is better than what they're getting paid currently. So you have these lower wages and they can be pretty much worked to death. So rather than having guest workers come in, you tend to move your manufacturing to those countries where, especially on things that are very labor intensive. This is how China experienced an economic boom, because yes, while you have a company that employs, 5,000-6,000 employees making something very simple, you're also paying them very little wages, to where a U.S. company, you have labor laws and you have labor rights where employees can expect certain benefits and certain working conditions. This is where a lot of the labor unions in the U.S. kind of popped up at. Now, guest workers, sometimes they often tend to be illegal, where they come in and they're getting paid very, very little. And because of that, people aren't following laws with it, and they have few rights when it comes to that work. Locals complain that immigrants are taking away jobs or overloading social services. There's a lot of debate that goes back and forth with this. There's very little evidence to say that they're overloading social services or they're taking away jobs that are, that would normally have been occupied by a local resident. Population growth and opposing factors to that growth. So pronatalist pressures, these are factors that increase the desire for children. Myself, I do not have any children myself, but it is one of those things that every single time you encounter someone, the number one question they always ask, or especially relatives, when are you going to have kids? So a lot of this is that increased factor or increased desire for children. It's a source of pleasure, pride, and comfort. You've probably heard living vicariously. It's where, if you've ever seen the show Friday Night Tykes, where these kind of overzealous parents get their children involved in football, and you watch them kind of snap into a rage over the smallest things, and where people start to threaten the lives of referees at a football game that's filled with like 8-year-olds. That's why, is because that's kind of their, like a trophy to them. And it's also a source of support for elderly parents. One of the things that my parents always say is, when are you going to help support us? When are you going to help support us? And a lot of that is just because, they're getting near, my parents are you know, 60s, and they're starting to get up there in age, and it's at the point where, you know, they're looking at retirement, and a lot of times they don't have a retirement kind of built up as what other people do, and so they look for that support in order to help them kind of live out the rest of their lives. And it's also a source of family income. You know, look at a lot of family businesses. If you have 2 children versus 4 children, you have more workers. You got 4. And then it's just social status too. There are, I know, it's very common that you see people kind of use their children as trophies. You know, this, look at what I've accomplished. I have a child, and so you have kind of this social status that is associated with it. And the reason it says social status is because that's not necessarily the case in every population. For myself, I don't need children for a social status because I have other accomplishments in life that I use. But for some people, that's their accomplishment is, you know, they've raised a child. And then also just replace members in society as they die. I remember when I was in boot camp, my chief was or one of my drill instructors was a surface sonar tech, an STG. And he one day in boot camp, because he was near retirement, he was getting near retirement, and I remember one of the things that he said in boot camp, he's like, who here plans on going to be a surface sonar tech? And one dude raised his hand, and it happened to be the only 17-year-old we had in boot camp. And he's just like, you are my replacement. He's like, when I retire, you know, in a year or 2 years or whatever, you are going to be my replacement. You are going to be the person that takes my spot out in the fleet. And it's kind of the same way. Like when I you know, stop becoming a teacher at Snyder through retirement or whatever, who's going to take my place? Because there will always be a replacement. And so that is kind of the role of students. You know, it's surprising how many people we have at our school as teachers who went to our school as a student. Boys tend to be more frequently valued than girls. This a lot of times depends on the culture that you're in. In the U.S., it doesn't tend to be that like, you don't tend to frequently value boys more than girls. They tend to kind of have equality based on where you're at. Again, like, it does a lot of times depend on your social context and other things behind it. So birth reproduction pressures, higher education and personal freedom for women often results in the decisions to limit having children. Like I said, in some societies, or in higher education, higher income societies, women tend to have a role in that environment other than just raising children. And because of that, they tend to have fewer children. So if you look at developed versus developing versus pre-industrial countries where women have a place in society, there tends to be fewer children, versus in lower income, lower education societies, they tend to be there just to raise children. This can also be seen within in populations within the United States. So if you look at lower income communities and lower income states, they tend to have a positive population growth, but they also tend to have a higher emigration rate. A lot of people leave those communities, but the number of children decreased quite a bit. And again, this is taken with a grain of salt because there's other societal pressures that play into that. So when women have more opportunities to earn salary, they're less likely to have children. Education and socioeconomic status are usually inversely related to fertility in wealthier countries. So as your education rate goes up, as your status or your wealth in society increases, the amount of children you have tends to decrease. So birth reproduction pressures. Developing countries' higher income often means families can afford more children, Thus, fertility often increases. There is this lag from when it's like, wow, I have a ton of money, to, okay, now how am I responsible with it? So as you have more money and as you have more food, you can afford to have more children because you can feed them and provide for them. And so there's this lag until the rest of society kind of catches up. In less developed countries, adding another child to the family usually does not cost much, when in developing countries, raising an additional child can carry significant costs. While I don't have any children myself, I do have a dog, and there's things that are associated with that, like you have to have a bed for him and a water bowl, and you have to buy food for him, and all sorts of other stuff, like a leash, and you have to take him to the vet. And so there's costs associated with that. I can only imagine what those costs would be for children, since the costs tend to be a lot higher, since you just can't like put a water bowl in front of them. So looking at United States birth rates, this is births per thousand, and then year along the x-axis. As you have this slight decrease from these as we're going through this transition. So this is post-industrial, then you hit the Great Depression, then there's kind of this spike, and then World War I ends, a lot of people come home, and you tend to have this decrease. And then the boomers, you have this spike, and then that tends to decrease quite a bit until we get near kind of the 75 going into the 80s. Then you end up with echo boom, which is where you have the millennials. And this mostly happens to be where at the time, media tends to become a bigger thing. People are making more money. The 80s were a good time economically, and therefore people are having more children. Cities start to become actual population centers rather than rural areas. So looking at these demographic transitions, model of falling death rates and birth rates due to improved living conditions accompany economic development. What is this actually saying? As you start to get more money, you see death rates start to decrease, but also you have a better quality of living. So postmodern or pre-modern society, poor conditions keep death rate highs as birth rates are correspondingly high. So think about ins versus outs at this point. Economic development brings better conditions and better standards of living, thus death rates fall, birth rates stay consistent, and sometimes they even rise. If you know that your child's going to survive its first 3 years of life, then you can have more with that economic development. Eventually, birth rates will begin to fall, though. This tends to happen when women get a role in society. So populations grow rapidly in time between death rates and birth rates falling. In developed countries, transition is complete when both death rates and birth rates are low, and then the population tends to reach equilibrium. So this is what this looks like. If you look at your total population, you could see that death rates start to plummet. This is happening as you're getting better in modern medicine, but notice that the birth rates kind of lag behind quite a bit. Now, this smoothing off, no country has quite seen this. We've gotten pretty close to it, but most countries that are near this still have a slight positive population growth. So optimism or pessimism. So some demographers believe the demographic transition is already taking place in developing countries, and world populations should stabilize during the next century. Others argue that many poor countries are trapped in the middle phase of transition, and their populations are growing so rapidly that human demands exceed sustainable resource yields. Basically, you have these poor countries that they have better access to medicine, but looking at it, the populations are tending to, but they still have a high birth rate, and therefore they're exceeding the amount of resources that they have, food, fresh water, things like that. And therefore it's going to lead to this localized exceeding of the carrying capacity. So social justice, one of the things that Marx brought up, still other demographers believe that in order for demographic transitions to work, resources must be distributed more equally. The world has enough natural resources, but inadequate social and economic systems cause maldistribution. Looking at family planning. Family planning allows couples to determine the number and spacing of their children rather than like my parents. I have a brother. We were born 1 year, 1 month apart. And we're allowed, or we can do different, or we can determine like, okay, we want to have what kids and when do we want to have them and how far apart do we want to have them. So birth control is any method used to reduce births. So traditional methods, long breastfeeding, taboos against intercourse while breastfeeding, celibacy, folk medicines, abortion, infanticide. And then current methods, avoidance of sex during fertile periods, mechanical barriers to prevent contact between sperm and egg, surgical prevention of sperm or egg release, chemical prevention, physical barriers to implantation, and abortion. So those are just methods that we have access to as a developed society. Other societies might not have access to that just because of lack of infrastructure. And then also social standards too. You know, if it's against your social upbringing or whatever to use any sort of birth control, that also kind of judges into family planning. Future of human population. So most demographers believe the world population will stabilize sometimes during the next century. We talked about that. Projections of maximum human population size. The low estimate's 8 billion, which we're creeping up to that right now. Medium is 9.3, and then the high end is 13. Remember earlier when I said the carrying capacity of the Earth is believed to be between 12 and 20 billion. 13 is over that lower estimate. So to kind of summarize everything, we looked at population growth and what limits there are. We looked at human demographics, fertility and mortality, lifespan and expectancy. So lifespan, going back to that, is how long an organism can live at its latest. Expectancy is what's the average. Population growth and the factors that oppose that. All right, so what causes them to decrease? Demographic transitions going from pre-industrial to developing to modern. Family planning, how, why, when people choose to have children, and future of human populations. So that is it. I wanted to finish this up a little bit early so that I could move over to Google Meets and answer any questions that you guys might have. So we'll go this. That will be it. The Google Meet link will be posted into PowerSchool right after I end this. But have a great rest of your day.